everyone, my name is Simon McDougall. I'm the Deputy Commissioner at the Information Commissioner's Office, and I am chairing this panel session. Thank you very much for joining us, and thanks very much to Turing for hosting us for this. We're discussing regulation and AI. It's an area which is very dear to my heart. I am responsible for all the areas around technology and innovation at the Information Commissioner's Office. And as will probably be mentioned some points along the way today, I also chair the Regulators and AI Working Group, which is an informal group of regulators and other interested bodies who get together to talk about, well, just these things basically. And the panel we have today has been drawn from that membership. So it's great to be here. I'm going to pass on to the panel members in a second to introduce themselves before we launch into this discussion. But before I do so, I just want to emphasize that we are really hoping to have as interactive a discussion as one can have when we're all sitting in our studies and kitchens and bedrooms. And I would be really grateful for people to start putting questions into Slido and both what you have up front and how you react to the different points that the panelists will be making in the first part of this session. And then we can use those questions to spur the discussion as we go. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to the panelists to introduce themselves, and then after that to say a few words about one of the aspects of this area. Let's go in the order we're going to be doing for the contributions. So I'm going to go to Kate, then Mohammed, then Guy, then Helen. Firstly, to introduce themselves and say hello. So Kate, over to you.
Hi, so I'm Kate Brand. I'm a Director of Data Science at the Competition and Markets Authority and leading our algorithms programme.
Okay, Mohammed.
Hi, thanks Simon. Hi, Mohammed Gabawi. So I work in the Bank of England's FinTech Hub, and I'm responsible for our AI strategy, our AI work, and in particular the AI Public-Private Forum.
And Guy?
Hi there, I'm Guy Parker. I'm the Chief Exec of the Advertising Standards Authority. We are the UK independent regulator of ads in all media, including online, and we are very interested in how we can use data science, AI, machine learning to improve our regulation and better understand all of the changes that are taking place in the advertising landscape.
That's right. And Helen?
I'm Helen Margetts. I'm Professor of Society and the Internet at the University of Oxford in the Oxford Internet Institute. And a lot of the time at the moment, I am at the Alan Turing Institute, where I direct the public policy programme, where we work with policymakers and regulators all across the UK public sector to work out ways to use data science and AI to improve governance and regulation. Thanks,
Helen. Now, there's this is obviously a massive area and lots of areas to explore within it. So each of the panelists is going to talk about an area of AI and regulation that they're working on right now. And then after that, we're going to go to the discussion. So Kate, can I ask you to kick off with discussing the CMA's work on algorithms?
Of course. Hi, everyone. So as I said before, I'm a Director of Data Science at the CMA. Let me first just tell you a little bit about the CMA, if you don't know. So it's the UK's Competition and Consumer Protection Agency. It's mostly case-driven, I would say, whether that be in whether to prevent mergers of companies or not, in antitrust, detecting cartels, consumer protection work, and that sort of thing. And increasingly, actually, both in casework and more generally, we're working in the digital sphere, so much more digital cases, particularly since we left the EU, and we're taking on some of the kind of bigger cases that would otherwise have gone to the European Commission. One of the particular things of interest, I think, is that we're taking on the Digital Markets Unit. It will be starting in shadow form next month. So this is really a new sort of system of where we will be regulating digital markets, including in an ex ante way, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. So I work in the Data Technology and Analytics Unit, so Data Unit for short. It's a team of about 35 data scientists, data engineers, data and technology insight officers, behavioural scientists and digital forensics specialists, so a lot of different specialists in there all working together. It's about 2 years old now as a team, and I think it's the largest team of data scientists and other sort of data specialists in any consumer and competition agency worldwide. And it's going to continue to grow as well to support the DMU as that starts to kind of ramp up, essentially. So in terms of our work on AI, that really splits into kind of two different areas. So firstly, we use AI and more general data science to help the CMA be more efficient and effective, basically at what it does in its casework and things. But then we're also increasingly looking at how companies themselves use AI and algorithms more generally in terms of identifying potential competition and consumer harms. So I'll say a little bit more about our internal use of AI and then move on to kind of how we're looking at companies. So on the internal use, let me just give you a few examples of some of the types of things that we do. So one example is where we've used NLP and continuous active learning to better identify relevant documents for merger cases. I mentioned before about when we are leaving the EU, we're getting bigger cases, so sometimes we might have millions of documents that caseworkers need to look through. So we're helping them to basically identify which documents they should read through. And then another example is when we've helped the CMA deal with, again, tens of thousands of consumer complaints due to COVID. So we had a kind of COVID task force where we had a page that people could complain on. And basically we used NLP and topic modeling to identify where the main issues were without actually having to go through manually and identify that. So this is things like price gouging or flight cancellation without kind of paying people and back their money, that sort of thing. So those are a couple of examples of things we've done internally, and there's quite a lot of other examples. On looking at how companies are using AI, so I'm leading what we call the Analysing Algorithms program. As part of this, in January, we published a paper that is exploring how algorithms can reduce competition and harm consumers. If you aren't aware of that, if you just type in CMA and algorithms into Google, then it should be fairly easy to find if you wanted to have a look at that. So I was going to say just a little bit about some of the things that we found in that paper. So one of the things we do is try and identify kind of what potential harms there are due to algorithms in the consumer and competition space. So we identified a number of potential harms to consumers. So some of those are things like opaque personalized pricing, personalization of a consumer's journey through a website or app more generally, and again in a way that's not transparent to the consumer, and it could be exploitative. Also, algorithms can be used to rank things in ways that might be profitable for the platform, but at the expense of the consumer. And actually, in almost all of these consumer cases, a lot of this is about using algorithms, but in a way that is not transparent and users are not aware of, and so it can be quite exploitative because they're not aware of what's going on. And then we also identify competition harms as well. So things like self-preferencing of platforms for their own products, unintended harms to downstream businesses. So this is, things like when Google changes its search algorithm, suddenly a bunch of businesses that basically are very dependent on Google for people finding their businesses suddenly can be affected. And also use of algorithms to collude and ultimately collude in prices, essentially, and ultimately that will increase prices kind of across the board. So when we wrote this paper partly because actually it's really filling a gap in the AI community. There's lots of material and lots of discussion on things like bias, transparency, and things. In the competition world, there's lots of talk on particular topics like personalized pricing, collusion, which involve algorithms or AI. But these communities aren't really that well joined up, we found, and this is kind of an area that hasn't been properly explored when you kind of pull these things together. And we had concluded that although these areas that have been looked at are important. They need to be kind of brought together and the communities brought together. And also that there are other wider harms as well that are less well researched, that need more attention. So one of those is the thinking about the way consumer journeys can be personalised in ways that may not be clear that they're happening, essentially. So even something like personalised pricing, there's been like a lot of work on it, but actually most research is looking at kind of the published advertised prices and looking to see like whether they're personalised and change from one person to another. It doesn't look like it's that prevalent, but part of that is because I think it's so obvious that consumers hate it, right? So it's not something that's very good for a business to do and be found out to do. But actually, I think what's maybe going on is the sort of real problem's more subtle than this, and it's a combination of different things that can be done to like nudge a consumer to basically pay higher prices, but without them kind of realizing that it's so explicit. So you know, things like ranking, personalized ranking, so that you know, consumers that are less price sensitive, maybe more, they won't look so far and they'll just click on the first thing, so they may like have different ranking to others, for example. So we think that we need a kind of more nuanced understanding of what's going on in these sorts of areas. So in the paper we also talk a bit about the kind of tools that you can use as well to understand, I guess, the algorithms that are behind these types of harms. And in the CMA we've got quite strong information gathering powers. So we talk in the paper about techniques that can be used to gather information about the algorithmic system, both with and without access to the kind of underlying code and data and that sort of thing, because actually initially you need to be able to identify whether there are harms, and you can actually do that quite often in the digital sphere, you know, online by querying querying just online. And but if you need to go more into detail, quite often you are going to need to be able to actually be able to see the underlying code and the data. We also talk a bit in the paper about like what we think regulators could do. So I emphasize the word could because this paper is really starting to just explore what we can do, and was also alongside a call for information where we've asked others to basically tell us what they think, that closed very recently. So in terms of the types of things that we've talked about, we include things like providing guidance, setting or clarifying standards, also using our consumer and competition powers to investigate and remedy algorithmic harms, or undertaking algorithmic monitoring. So that's kind of potentially something we could do as part of an ex-ante pro-competitive regime like the one I talked about in the DMU. But it's early days, I think, with that, and we're just starting to think about it and yeah, and talk on panels like this about this sort of area. Yeah, so we, as I said, we've just.
And Kate, in terms of the call for information, is the CMA going to produce a document in response to the submissions you've had?
Yeah, so we'll produce a summary document, I think in a couple of months, as well as the responses that we've had as well. So yes, we'll be publishing those.
Fantastic.
And that will also inform us basically on the next steps of where we want to go with our algorithms program. So if there are areas that seem like there's actually particular harms or particular cases as well, so that's basically going to use to inform us. We do know, of course, that we are taking forward a program of work on algorithmic kind of regulation with the DRCF. So this is the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. So it's a kind of voluntary collaboration between some of the big regulators on well, joint working, basically. So it includes the CMA, the ICO, Ofcom, and very soon FCA as well. And we just published a work plan on that. If you're interested, you should be able to fairly easily find that again just by Googling it. And basically, so it's a wider thing, it's a wider cooperation thing, but one of the strands is specifically on I think it's processing algorithms. So it is about how do we think about, like, going forward, the things that we have in common. So quite often, right, it's international. We're often talking about the same algorithms, or at least the same companies, and we may have different concerns that might be about competition, consumer, it might be about privacy, it might be online harms. But actually, we probably want to join up for the companies to make sure that they don't have multiple regulators talking to them. But also, we'll be needing to kind of use fairly similar tools to understand those things. So I'll stop there. And
thank you, Kate, very much. Mohammed, passing over to you and reminding everyone to keep dropping your questions into Slido. Mohammed.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks, Kate. And I think a lot of what Kate just said actually kind of gels and aligns with the kind of things we're thinking about as well. And just to say that we also at the Bank of England have a sort of internal work where we're using AI and we're thinking about AI. Quite a bit of research that we do internally on AI, but a lot of our work is also sort of on the external side. So, I mean, in terms of sort of the bank's objectives, the objective is that we support, or we want to increase support for the safe adoption of AI in financial services. We think there are a lot of benefits that accrue from AI, but clearly there are also sort of risks and challenges in that area. And the cornerstone of sort of what we're doing in terms of our strategy is as I mentioned, the AI Public-Private Forum. And this is a joint project with our colleagues at the Financial Conduct Authority. It came out of the sort of the 2019 Future Finance Report and our response to it. And it was flagged in a speech by Mark Carney. But because of sort of COVID and sort of timelines being pushed, the forum itself wasn't launched until October 2020. So that was, it's supposed to last for sort of a year. And we have a series of quarterly meetings and workshops. And this is structured around 3 broad topic areas. So you've got data, model risk management, and governance. And the data sessions, the meetings and the workshops actually sort of concluded yesterday. The reason we've got it sort of structured in that way is that this is the sort of hierarchical way that we think about the risks that come from AI. So if you think of it sort of starting with the data level, which is, I guess, kind of the bedrock of all AI systems, and that then feeds into the models that use the data, that process the data, and then you've got the sort of the model risk management layer, and that then feeds into the corporate level, the business model level, and the thinking around the governance around that. All of that, of course, fits within a sort of the systemic level, which we will also be discussing through the AI PPF, as well as the regulatory angle on that. So the forum itself has 21 members. It's drawn from across the financial sector. So we've got sort of banks, insurers, asset managers. We've got fintechs in there, and technology providers, so Googles of the world and so on. But the members are there to act as experts. So they're not representing their firms. They're there. It's a body of experts rather than a kind of an industry body, as it were. We also have 5 observers on the AIPPF. So the Information Commissioner's Office is one of them, the Government's Office for AI, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, the Treasury, and finally the Fake Market Standards Board is also one of the observers. In terms of sort of the aims of it, what we're trying to get out of it, I guess, firstly, really, it's sort of to share information, to understand the challenges that the AI and machine learning have within financial services, if there are any barriers to deployment, and any sort of risks and trade-offs there are. And importantly, to kind of gather views on where, so there's quite a bit of regulation out there. So there's quite a lot of principles, guidance, even good practice examples out there. We'd like to understand that in more detail, see where intervention may be helpful, where we can remove barriers if those exist, and finally to consider basically what the next stage is in terms of what's a useful way to engage with industry and firms going forward. The forum itself, it's not a decision-making body, so Alongside that, on a kind of a parallel track, we are looking at the regulatory framework to understand what existing regulation looks like, how it may apply to AI. This includes models, it includes data, and so on, and where there are gaps in the regulation, where possibly the interventions may be useful. In terms of the forum's outputs, firstly, we are publishing anonymized minutes of the meetings, and the first couple of those are on our website, and you can Google those. And the second part is there will be a final report at the end of the process, so hopefully by the end of this year or early next year. And this will detail the findings, so sort of splits kind of in sort of where the problem areas are and where the solutions are, and recommendations and next steps in that process. So I think that kind of covers really what we're doing in very general terms, and I'll stop there. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to obviously take questions on that, and I look forward to the questions. So back to you, Simon.
Thanks, Mohammed. I see some more questions coming in now, so keep them coming. Thank you. Guy, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the ASA's journey working towards using AI, and this is very much, as I said in my intro, we're at the Advertising Standards Authority. We're the UK independent regulator of ads in all media, and that includes the ever-increasing amounts of advertising online. And we're focused primarily on regulating the content and targeting of UK ads. We're not an economic regulator. We don't deal with competition type issues. Under our current 5-year strategy, which is called More Impact Online, we are moving our regulation towards more proactive, tech-assisted intelligence gathering, complaint handling, monitoring, and enforcement. And obviously understanding and using technology, including data science, is fundamental to our successful delivery of that strategy. It's the thread that runs through it, if you like. And I wanted to make 3 points on the back of that. First of all, technology is at the heart of so much innovation in advertising. Think of targeted online advertising, personalized advertising content, personalized pricing, which Kate touched on, recommendation engines, voice assistants, not to mention more cutting edge technologies like augmented and virtual reality and biometrics and so on. So it's vital that regulators like us understand developments in those areas, and obviously the CMA's work on analyzing algorithms and any future DRCF work in that space is going to be really, really helpful to us. The second point is that using data science, including AI and machine learning, is crucial to tackling the scale challenge that we face regulating online ads. I mean, online advertising is already massive. It continues to grow rapidly, spurred by the pandemic. There are innumerable actors, by which I mean advertisers, from sole traders operating from their bedrooms to the world's biggest companies. And it's very heterogeneous. Paid online ads pose very different regulatory challenges to advertising claims by businesses on their own websites, social media spaces and apps, their own real estate, if you like, which in turn pose very different challenges to influencer and native advertising, where brands collaborate with either social media influencers or online publishers. And the third point is that gatekeepers like platforms have a key role to play in making sure that the ads that they make money from, so much money that they've grown to be some of the biggest companies on the planet, comply with the UK advertising codes that we police. They invest tens of millions in algorithms and human moderators to check content appearing on their platforms, including paid ad content. But there are, at the moment, as you've all heard, legitimate societal concerns about accountability. Who's marking their homework? Who's checking their algorithms? So we put together a data science strategy. It focuses on using technology to understand better the views of the public and stakeholders, to become more efficient, for example, in our complaint handling, to be more effective, for example, in our monitoring and enforcement, and I've got one or two examples of that in a second, and to engage better, to practice what we call collective regulation with other regulators and with the industry, including platforms. And we've made pretty good progress already. We've, for example, worked with third-party tech companies on our avatar monitoring and our CCTV style monitoring programs. Those programs are successfully tackling age inappropriate targeting of ads for gambling, alcohol, food, time, fat, salt and sugar, e-cigarettes, and one or two other categories that are prevented by our rules from being addressed to under 18s, or in some cases under 16s. And those monitoring programs using technology, they are world leading. We're the first advertising regulatory body in the world to be running those sorts of programs. We're now investing in our own in-house data science capability. That capability has already helped us to deploy, in only 2 months, a scam ad predictor, which uses NLP and computer vision to predict which of the thousands of scraped ads that we run through it are highly likely to be scam ads. And we then send scam ad alerts to the platforms and the ad networks to get them to take them down and to suspend the accounts of the scammers. What have we learned so far? Well, once you've got your data science strategy in place, you can get up and running super quickly. I mean, it literally takes only one data scientist, although obviously it's got to be the right one. And they typically bring their own laptops with them. And most of the models that they are going to be using are available open source. So you don't need to make big investments in technology stacks to get going, or in people. We've obviously got so much more to learn and so much more to do. We're a small regulator compared to the CMA, the FCA, and so on. We're still very much in the foothills. And for example, and this is a bit of a plug, if you'll forgive me, we are actively recruiting at the moment for our first head of data science to help to build our data science capability. So if there are any data scientists out there in search of a job, you know who to Google. But I know enough already to be a huge evangelist for smaller regulators understanding and using data science and AI, and I'm more firmly convinced than ever that those that don't will, I'm afraid, be left behind. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. Keep the questions coming. Who needs the Cheltenham Festival when you can watch the runners and riders on Slido? It's quite exciting to see various questions move up on the inside track and get to the top. So keep the questions coming and keep voting on them. And then finally, Helen, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what draws all this together. What are the common problems and solutions that regulators are offered? And in a way, my fellow panelists have almost done all my work for me, because they've mentioned lots of really good examples of what I might be talking about here. So as I said, I'm the director of the public policy program at the Turing, and we work to try and improve governance and regulation with data science and AI. We work with around, we've worked at some level with around 80 public sector organisations, including several regulators. And I guess during that time, we were set up in 2018. We've observed that there's kind of two main categories of question here that you might have about AI. Some of them are how questions. How do you do things? How do you get the kind of expertise and capacity, the technical expertise and capacity to do the things that the other panelists have talked about? Modelling, for example, or the question that Kate mentioned of sort of needing to understand what the companies are doing with machine learning, for example. You know, that requires some understanding of the kind of state of the art of, say, research into online harms, for example. And then there's the should questions. How do you get kind of usable ethical frameworks for the use of AI based on solid principles, and how do you put those into practice? And we worked with the ICO on the project Explain, which worked on that specific question, for that question for the specific issue of transparency and explainability. How do you build kind of explainable principles for AI? So we, like everybody here, we sit on the Information Commissioner's Office Working Group for AI and Regulation, and kind of born out of that that work with regulators, the Office of AI asked the Public Policy Programme back last year, we're doing it now, to carry out some research and write a report on this idea of common capacity. What is that everybody is needing? What are the common challenges that regulators are facing, and what would some sort of common capacity for dealing with those challenges look like? And it was kind of born out of this idea that there is generalizability, both of the challenges, kind of the challenges that AI throws up at the basic task of regulation, and then there's generalizability about solutions. One of the things that we've observed in our work with the policy sector, that perhaps more than earlier technologies or earlier kind of ways of doing policy and regulation, AI-based technologies lend themselves to kind of developing solutions for a particular sort of problem, like, for example, looking at price personalization or age verification or that kind of thing in kind of one part of the forest, the policy forest, and developing that for a solution in another. It's not really the way the British government has traditionally worked, which tends to be very sort of organisationally siloed. And if somebody has a problem in one department, they probably tend to look for a solution that was developed within that department. But there is a lot of mileage in looking outside a specific organisational context and thinking about things in the round. So again, this applies to sort of the should questions. What kind of, and I can see some questions in the chat coming up about that, you know, the questions around accountability. Guy mentioned accountability. All regulators need to think about those kind of questions. Fairness and bias, I think Kate mentioned that. All regulators need to think about that in the markets that they're dealing with. And this question of transparency that I mentioned before, and explainability, also something that any kind of consumer facing regulator needs to think about. And then there's the question of the how questions, you know, what do you do with these technologies? How do you use them? Or how do you understand what companies are doing with them and what they could be doing better in a more ethical sort of way? And I guess a good example there, a very obvious example really, is the question of detection. You know, prediction and machine learning. Prediction sort of steals the show for machine learning. It's what receives the most attention and publicity. But machine learning is super good for detection, for detecting unwanted behavior of some kind, for example. And that's what a lot of regulators need to think about in terms of what companies are doing or could be doing more of in that kind of area. There are other kinds of rationale for the idea of common capacity. I mean, Kate mentioned, you know, talking to companies. Do you all want to? Do you want companies to be faced with talking to lots of different regulators about related issues? That's another argument for some sort of joined up research. Yeah, the question of algorithmic monitoring as well. It's something that every single regulator is quite possibly likely to be doing. So that's the argument for some sort of model for common capacity, some sort of joined up approach that would help here. And that's what we're working on now for the Office of AI. We're doing the research now. And we'll produce a report on that. We have a governance group which is composed of several of the regulators here, and also some who aren't here, like Ofcom, for example. The Centre of Data Ethics and Innovation is also there on the governance group. The research is ongoing. I can tell you kind of what we're doing. Of course, I can't tell you what the results are yet because, well, because we haven't got them yet. But we're developing some case studies. We're talking to regulators kind of right across the regulatory landscape. We want to get diversity in terms of sector, for example, because there are generic, generalizable problems and solutions, as I've said, but there are also kind of more vertical sector-specific challenges, which might just involve a group of regulators, financial services, for example, or something like that. We're trying to get diversity in the kind of people we're talking to, because depending where you sit in regulation, whether you're a policy person or an operational person or a compliance person, you might get different challenges and so on, and think about AI in different ways. And a key thing is size. Guy mentioned that. Some regulators are very large and can develop big data science and AI capacity, and already starting to do that. And then some regulators are really small. I mean, Guy mentioned being one of the smaller regulators, but some are really small. They're just like a handful of people, and they really aren't going to be able to develop much capacity in this, but it will still affect them. So it's the question of how we can look for some kind of model for common capacity that might help right across the board, large and small. As I said, I can't say anything about the results because we don't have them yet. I can tell you, however, that it's already very clear that this idea of some kind of joint approach is a good idea. One of the things that we started off looking for when we started this research was a kind of definitive list of all the regulators in the UK, so that we could sample which ones we were going to talk to and build into the research. We discovered, and feel free to tell me that I'm wrong, but we discovered that no such basic list actually existed. Indeed, this will be one of the outputs of the research, to evolve a list and then kind of put it out for consultation to work out exactly what it should be. But there's some kind of joining up that we really thought would have been done already, but actually hasn't, and sort of shows that we do need to think about these things. So I'll stop there. Obviously, the research will be coming out at the end of this year, and we'll be very interested to discuss it with people. I do think there's a big opportunity for the UK here. The UK has always had a kind of reputation for sound regulation. And the question of being a sort of pace setter in this really key question, which is like facing every country in the world, this relationship between regulation and AI, both in terms of regulating AI and using AI for smarter regulation. There's a real opportunity here to take a lead in that area. So it's a very exciting area. Thank you.
Helen, thank you so much. And thanks to all the panelists for their contributions there. So as most of you can probably see on Slido, it's getting vicious out there. The votes are flying in, and we have quite a few different points. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to pick some of the bigger picture questions first, and then leave time so we can drop on some of the more specific questions as we go along, whether they're specific to a particular person here or they're very specific in terms of what they're asking. So we can start on the big picture and zoom down a bit, but we'll try and clear the top bracket of questions as they go along. So Hannah, you were there first with the medical device piece, but we'll come back to that as we go through and we zoom in on particular points. So I'm going to merge a couple of questions actually there, which is there's a question in Slido around whether there's a need for additional regulation here. What is the, is our applicable regulatory framework capable of addressing the challenges of AI, or do we need specific new AI regulation? And as part of that, there's another question which is around whether the best rules are soft rules around guidance and protocols, or whether we need a new statute to regulate AI. So I'll crush those two together into this general question as to, well, do we think in the UK the rules and the frameworks we have are fit for purpose, or do we need to go and actually write some new rules, and whether it's guidance or statute, actually get some new stuff out there? So I'm looking to see who fancies leading on that one, which obviously is one of the bigger questions out there. So I've got Mohammed and Kay. I think Kay, you're going to lead on the next one. So I'll go to Mohammed first on this one. Mohammed, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I mean, this is a very, very interesting question and very important for us. I'm afraid my kind of answer to it is we don't yet know whether we need the guidance and where it's needed and so on, and whether the existing system is fit for purpose. And the reason for that is that it's firstly very complicated in terms of existing regulation. And as I said, we're kind of looking at it sort of as we go along. There's a whole series of regs out there, which include everything from sort of GDPR, which is within the ICO's domain, obviously, to the kind of stuff that the Bank of England has, to some FCA domain regulation. And it's not yet clear whether there is a need for anything. And that partly goes back to how we think about what is AI and what is it that we're trying to achieve. AI is a general purpose technology, and I think we need to think about what are the desired outcomes, what is it that AI is doing in terms of the way people are using it. And the second difficulty, I think, in looking at it is we are obviously looking at AI as it is today. We're looking at use cases and best practices as they are today. But it's a very fast, rapidly evolving field. And we need to sort of start thinking so 3, 4, 5 years ahead. What's it going to look like? Where are the emerging risks? Where are the horizon risks that are coming out of it? And then think what kind of regulatory framework would support that, would actually encourage the innovation. Because on the one, it's not just regulating the risks and making sure that the risks are managed and well controlled, but actually promoting innovation. We don't want to stifle innovation. We want it to kind of to improve and to be out there. So I think it's balancing these two and the sort of the forward-looking. It's a bit of a cliched phrase, but sort of future-proof regulation is, I guess, what we're aiming for. So I hope that kind of addresses the question, at least partly.
Thank you, Mohammed. And Kate?
Yeah, so I was actually going to say something very, very similar to Mohammed, but I guess that's a good thing because it means that there's some consensus on this. I think I was just going to point out, that the use of algorithmic systems, AI as well, it's across such a vast array of use cases with like a really large number of potential areas of harm. And so, thinking about, I think obviously a lot about consumer protection, competition, but whether that's privacy or equality or online harms to people as citizens, you've got to consider it in those, well, I think it needs to be considered in those different areas or potential areas of harm or sectors. And then you need to think about whether those areas have got their kind of regulation and stuff up to scratch for the kind of modern age to be able to actually tackle kind of some of the AI problems. And there probably is some modernising and strengthening of laws that probably need to be done in some of those areas. But yeah, they need to be kind of considered, I think, in those all those different areas, rather than thinking about kind of AI as kind of one sort of chunk of stuff, I suppose. And yeah, and I think, again, similar to Mohammed's point, I often sort of think people talk about kind of, we need to regulate AI. It's a bit like sort of saying we need to regulate decision making. Which no one would ever really propose because that's obviously so vast. And I know I'm being a bit flippant here because it's there are things in common of way algorithms work and the way that you might actually kind of look at those and the kind of particular problems that you get via them. But at the same time, AI is ultimately a tool to make that decision, and it's better to think, I think, about the harms and particular ways AI can be harmful, like in the context in which the harm is, basically.
Great, thanks, Kate. It's yeah, I think it's something we've struggled with at the ICO. I think it's these points around defining what AI is are critical. In our guidance so far, we've avoided going too far down that rabbit hole of trying to define AI. I think very often it's just right now it's a shorthand for machine learning, and obviously there are lots of big discussions and whole conferences about how to define AI more broadly. But we felt it's kind of takes too much bandwidth to really nail that down. So we end up, but without nailing it down, it's hard to actually get to the bottom of, well, is additional regulation needed? Although we may all, I know a lot of the speakers have spoken about gaps already, and we may get on to some discussions around possible, more detailed gaps as we go. There are a couple of questions in the list on Slido around how regulators keep up with the pace of change. So, so how can regulators stay ahead of the game? Should they stay ahead of the game? So let's try and cover that in terms of how we actually keep pace and how do we manage addressing innovation and new technology adoption proactively as regulators. So first off, Helen, could I ask you to say a few words on that one?
Sure, thank you. And yeah, this really, I mean, that is one of the things that I think that common capacity could be helpful for, in terms of kind of in individual areas, thinking about the kind of state of the art of research. I think that's going to be something really difficult for individual regulators to do, and it could be something that common capacity might have to offer. I mean, an example there, we're doing quite a bit of work with Ofcom on the question of hate, online hate speech, and there it's really about kind of understanding what can be expected of the companies, which is changing all the time. I mean, we've seen a lot of changes from companies recently in terms of kind of automatic moderation of using AI to basically moderate hate speech automatically, as opposed to with human content moderation. And it is a question of keeping a pace with that. And that, I mean, in that particular instance, we have a lot of research going on hate speech and detection and classification and everything. And then we feel that is part of our job in a way to do that, but it's not necessarily part of a regulator's job. So I do think that's where some sort of sharing in particular, because also in some areas, the larger regulators will be like kind of world experts on some aspects of AI innovation. And then it's a question of kind of sharing it with other regulators. So it's kind of knowledge exchange, building in the patterns of knowledge exchange, and not tackle these things in silos is, I think, is going to be really valuable here, because obviously it is a huge challenge.
Thanks, Helen. And Guy?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on the back of that. I mean, I agree with everything that Helen said. But there's a sort of philosophical question here, I think, about whether regulators should ever be ahead of change. Whether they can be, but whether they should be, because there's the potential for that to really stifle innovation. I think it's probably true to say that regulators, if they're doing well, will be just behind the most cutting-edge innovation, and focusing hard on keeping up and understanding what that change means, and making sure that their toolkit is right to address any harms, any societal harms that may come out of people's use of that technology. But I mean, I shy away from the idea of regulators checking new technology before it's introduced to the market. I think that would be a very bad thing.
Thanks, Guy. We're going to go into a question now about third parties. So this is one of the very first questions that came onto the list, and it was a question around what kind of criteria do authorities need to consider to qualify certified third-party vendors who provide them with AI products and services. So this is obviously, I think, an increasingly pressing question as we have more commoditized AI products, and we have longer supply chains, when perhaps in the very early days of AI, a lot of stuff was homegrown and homebrewed, and so this was less of an issue. Kate's volunteered to go first on this one. So Kate, what do you think?
So yeah, I think as you said, Simon, I think it's increasingly we're going to need to be kind of looking at this. I think that particularly with the CMA, like our remit is across the whole economy, right? And as regulators, we are not going to be able to, in the future, audit all algorithms that any company would use. It would be absolutely vast, right, and not doable at all. And so we need to start thinking about, how do we make sure that if third parties perhaps are doing the auditing, or that those third parties are audited by others. It gets very complicated. So it's something that I think we're in early stages of. It's the sort of thing that I think the DRCF will probably start thinking about it because again, it goes across, I think, how we're thinking about things for regulators. There's been some interesting stuff in the news recently as well, actually, about problems with these there's a whole industry coming up of auditing kind of companies, essentially. So there was one, I think, and it was about in recruitment, AI tools in recruitment, and Cathy O'Neill's new company had kind of done an audit of one of these, but it was a very narrow audit. And then, of course, they could use that to kind of promote that it was an audited algorithm and everything was great. And but of course, it was only very narrowly audited, and those auditing firms don't have any backing, essentially, to sort of or any kind of standards that are set. So that's something I think as well that we might need to think of as regulators.
That was the higher view case, wasn't it? That was something that higher view. And there might be there's areas here where we can learn from earlier disciplines. I always think it's interesting how in many ways the cybersecurity field has learned some of the lessons that there may be that the field of AI can learn from as it goes ahead. It's another area which started off being very technology led and very technical, and as things have gone on, then the ability to use different tools and understand which vendors have credibility and which tools have credibility and completeness and are robust has evolved rapidly. But obviously the cybersecurity industry has been around for much longer. And it's something I often say as a regulator at the ICO is that I think many of the cases we'll be dealing with at the ICO over time in AI will be the basic errors. And in terms of third parties, it'll often be people buying products which are really quite unsatisfactory and quite unwise to buy, but they're being bought by fairly naive consumers, and basic checks will go a long way, rather than the more interesting and exotic risks that we might talk about in terms of some aspects of how AI evolves. So I think a lot of the basics around third parties will be basic good practice around third party procurement, and we can look to other areas of technology and information risk management to see what lessons we can learn. So I'm going to, if it's okay with everybody, I should have said we took a solemn vow at the start of this that basically we'd have two of the panelists speak to every question. So we're trying to pinky promise that we'll kind of keep to ourselves on that. Any other points on third parties?
I mean, I'm happy to come in, Simon, unless you want to keep it to two. But I mean, I was just going to say that for us, when we look at the third parties, first of all, we've noticed a pickup in interest in third parties as a result of COVID, because it's sort of easier to use sort of machine learning as a service type models. Also, there's data. It's third-party data versus third-party models, which is a sort of two separate things that we're looking at. And the way we're approaching it from a regulatory perspective, if you like, is actually kind of looking at it from an outsourcing, as an outsourcing issue in general. So kind of picking up what you're saying, Simon, is that it's not sort of AI specific, but it's sort of outsourcing, whether it's cloud outsourcing or whatever. And we have a consultation paper out there to think about these kind of issues I guess dependencies on data or the model side of it.
Thanks, Mohammed. I think we're going to do one more quite big picture question and then make sure we cover off some of the more specific points that people have raised. And I think it's probably worth us touching a bit on explainability, which has come up as one of the more popular questions. So the question is, not all algorithms are explainable. Should there be any regulations around which use cases can use unexplainable algorithms? And Helen, obviously the work that the Turing and the ICO did, which you've already mentioned around explainability, and we did jointly, spoke to some aspects of this. Is it okay if I ask you to lead off on explainability and we go from there?
Sure. Well, it's a really it's a good question, but I mean, I do think it's a question of degree. I mean, nothing is completely explainable. You could argue, and nothing is completely unexplainable. So what Project Explain did in the ICO guidance on explainability, you know, goes into a great deal of detail of how you can maximize explainability. And it also involved, and I think this is an important point to note, that the sort of science of involving citizens in these kind of judgments has really moved on since the old days when it was a sort of focus group at best and probably nothing. And in fact, the Project Explain included really detailed, I think, lasting on multiple days of citizens' juries, where citizens were presented with different scenarios and asked what they would have expected, they would expect of explainability in those kind of settings. And yeah, I think it is important to do that kind of work when you're thinking about explainability, and in particular settings. There is much more you can do than you used to be able to do to think about the citizens' viewpoint. And there are also, I mean, one of the guidance that does is it goes through all the different kind of machine learning algorithms and judges them on the question of interpretability, and there are some kind of some models of machine learning, neural nets, for example, multi-layered neural nets, for example, that are just always, you're building yourself a huge task for explainability right from the get-go. So in those points, you know, maybe what you should be doing is pushing towards different models to prioritize explainability in that way. And then another point to make, I guess, is that in situations, in really highly complex situations where it's very hard to kind of build in explainability, then maybe the other kind of principles, the kind of ethical principles that you would expect to AI, have to be kind of brought in to as a kind of belt and braces. I don't know, with maybe a greater mandate on accountability. If explainability can't kind of be built into the model, then maybe there has to be a different kind of accountability, or somebody has to kind of take accountability for certain aspects of the model behavior. So I'm sorry that's not a sort of magic wand sort of answer, but there isn't a magic wand here, but there is. I mean, I think if you break the task down, if you look at specific contexts, and you think about the question of citizen involvement and how that can be built into a process, there are all sorts of ways around the challenge of explainability.
And I quite agree. And one personal observation for me in this area is there are truly models out there which aren't explainable or are very hard to explain. I do think there's a middle ground where there's a lot of poorly designed models that could be explained if they're built properly and aren't. And especially if you are building models that are going to have really big consequences for people, I think it's pretty important that you do your best to try and ensure explainability from the outset, because otherwise it risks becoming at least almost a get out of jail free card for not being able to challenge your models properly. But Mohammed, have you got any thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you. I agree with everything that's been said, Simon and Helen. And I think the work that you've done is really interesting in this area. I mean, I'd just add that sort of explainability, I guess in principle there are sort of models that simply cannot be explained. They're just too complex, and they may be sort of deep neural network models or whatever that cannot be explained. But I guess the point for me is why do we need the explainability? Where do we need the explainability? And the two areas. So if you've got internal within businesses, within firms, financial institutions, and the external side of it. And the external side of it, I think, also goes to trust in AI models, in AI services. And I think we need to build that trust in order to then, it's a service circle where then firms are more confident to adopt AI models and so on, because the customer side of it has that trust. From the internal side, I think there's also sort of some maybe anecdotal sort of evidence that there's some reticence on the part of banks, insurance companies, and so on to start using AI models, and that's partly because of this lack of understanding. And it's sort of there's a gap between the data science level and the senior management level, which is commissioning these models. Again, because it's not clear what the models are doing, and it goes back to explainability. And if we have good sort of processes around that, then it makes it easier for senior managers to kind of buy into what the data science teams are producing and the models that they're building.
Thank you, Mohammed. We're going to move on now to some of the questions coming up, which are more specific. And so we're going to, if we have time, we're going to talk to the questions in Slido around medical devices. There's a particular question on the ASA, which I'm going to roll Guy's way, obviously. And then there's a great question around GPT-3. I'll lead on medical devices because as I'm the accountable executive at the ICO for all of our COVID response work, which means that having not had a huge amount of exposure to the health sector prior to joining the ICO, where I was more involved with technology and financial services in my main sectors, I ended up doing an awful lot of work in this area over the last, how long has it been? Well, it's just been exactly a year from lockdown, hasn't it? And a bit more before that, obviously. I think the question in Slido is around how medical device and privacy regulations should interact for AI. I mean, the first thing to say is that it's an evolving question. There's no set piece answer to this. I think it's entirely fair to say that within the ICO, if you go back to 2018, when the GDPR came in play, then the ICO's work was very much focused on just getting the new regime up to speed and getting lots of general guidance out. And it's really only been as we got into 2019 that we started looking at specific sector-focused questions again with the same rigor that we might have done a few years ago. We've had to kind of go from the general to the specific. And everything right now is flavoured by COVID. I do think that the ICO's engagement with the health sector overall has accelerated hugely during COVID for all the obvious reasons, because there's been data sharing issues, ranging from the very early days of how we manage shielded persons lists and who can get hold of those to help protect people who are shielding in those very distressing times this time last year, through to discussions right now around health certification and vaccine passports and those kind of things. Through that, we have done a lot of work with the MHRA as one of the many regulators in the health sector, in particular, say, around contact tracing and the contact tracing apps, which, because being in some ways medical devices in themselves, and suddenly our phones are becoming medical devices. The interaction from a ICO point of view is always going to be about following the data. So if there's data involved which is relating to people, then if it's being collected through a medical device, we'll be applying all the usual things that we expect to see in any situation there. And a lot of the challenges in medical devices, I'd argue, from a data protection point of view, are in some ways generic IoT questions. So, okay, if somebody if it's a wearable or an implant or some other medical device up on a person that's collecting information about them, then you have issues around, well, how do you achieve transparency and fairness around a device that may not actually have a screen. Where do you intervene on the user journey to make sure that the user has the right expectations around that? You also have standard issue questions we'd see with a lot of IoT around security, where sadly in many IoT devices security is a bit of an afterthought, and that's the same whether it is something which is part of someone's pacemaker, or whether it's a badly secured nanny cam, which means that somebody can hack in and see kids in a nursery. These are all kind of generic questions. So that's the way we'll go. But we are much better positioned now than we were, say, a year ago, just in terms of our ongoing work and relationships with the health regulators. So how that works within AI, that's something we're engaged with. We're very much engaged with NHSX and the work that they're doing around AI in this sector. We're very much engaged with MHRA. But I won't pretend it's anything other than work in progress. This is something we need to keep working on. So I'm not too sure with this wonderful panel we have much more to say on medical devices, but I'm looking to the panel to see if anyone else wants to pick that one up. I think that's a fair enough answer, but hopefully I've taken that particular bullet for everybody. So let's go on to this question around the ASA. So for those of you who can't see Slido, the question was, interesting that ASA looks out for scam ads and gets platforms to remove them. Shouldn't that burden be on the platforms? So Guy, over to you on that one.
Thank you, Simon. It's a gregreat question, and the simple answer is, of course, yes. The platforms are already investing, I mean, way more money than we have on using algorithms and humans to check the content that appears on their platforms, whether it's ads or other content. Society, people in society have got legitimate questions over how well they're doing that, and over how transparent that role that they play is. We've got an important work stream that is looking at holding the platforms to greater account for the pre and post controls and filters that they apply to ads, to make sure that they're responsible. And that's a crucial bit of work for us. But don't forget that scam ads aren't just appearing they aren't just appearing on platforms. They aren't just appearing in the walled gardens of platforms. They're appearing on the open internet too. And quite a high proportion of the scam ads that we are finding are appearing on the open internet. Most of them without the involvement of the likes of Google or Facebook, who also obviously are involved in open internet advertising.
Thank you, Guy. And Kate, are you going to come in on this point as well?
Yeah, just to add really that this is, as well as kind of scam ads, there's like a whole bunch of other kind of things where it's a really live issue at the moment, I think. And I think some of the big platforms are really kind of becoming kind of quasi-regulators, as it were, because they're so huge and sort of overseeing these kind of different things. So, yeah, things like fake online reviews or content moderation, all those sorts of things. So it's a really live issue, and I think it's going to be something that we're going to be, talking about a lot more in the future, and how that kind of is almost regulated, and whether they should be making the rules or not, and how that works.
Thanks, Kate. So with the next question we're going to deal with is a question around GPT-3. It says, who is looking at regulating big data language models, e.g. GPT-3? It very likely uses works in copyright to train models for NLG without compensating creators. I'll say a couple of words on the kind of regulatory scope question, and then see, Helen, you're going to come on this one as well, if that's okay. So I know it's Helen is now waving that she's okay, so let's see how this one goes. I think the one thing I'd say here is, I think there's always a good question with AI, coming back to some of the points the panel's already made about whether, well, what we're actually regulating here. Are we regulating AI itself, or are we regulating, a particular activity or a harm, or those bits and pieces? So as a data protection regulator, then we're interested in everything where there's the processing of data about people. But if there's no personal data processing involved, then at least in terms of our data protection scope, we have other bits of statute we have to work to. But in terms of our personal data protection scope, then then we don't have a remit, and we look to others. Likewise, you would look to the Equality and Human Rights Commission if you're looking for questions around discrimination. Questions around IP and copyright tend to go through the courts and don't tend to be areas that we look at directly. So it would be looked at through that prism initially, rather than that particular question. So with big data language models, then if there's general questions, or there's lots of different things in that question. There's really interesting questions that have come out in the last few months around risks of bias in those models, which could raise questions around equality, human rights, discrimination, but also maybe fairness, and to the point around what data may reside in the training models and what copyright there may be around that. Then that sounds like might end up being something that goes through the courts and be in other areas of law than the ones that we are competent or have remit about. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think that's definitely in the it's complicated bracket, and we'd be looking to break it down into, well, what is the activity, what is the harm, and then where does it go from there. Any other points to that? Mohammed, do you want to say anything around this?
Yeah, I mean, I actually just echo what you just said, Simon. And just to add that sort of, so GPT-3 basically is sort of an embedding, an aggregation, or a kind of processing of massive amounts of data, essentially. I'm simplifying. But the one area we're sort of looking at quite a lot is synthetic data in general, where you're using models to generate data that can then be used somewhere else. And actually, we're thinking, or not us, but people are using this, in fact, to enhance privacy, because you can mask certain characteristics, you can mask biases, you can change it and play around with it. So rather than thinking of it purely as we need to regulate this and what's going into it, which is obviously a question we need to think about, there are actually a lot of uses to using synthetic data to model various processes and so on. And I guess GPT-3 is kind of on, I mean, it's a very, very advanced version of that, I guess.
Thanks, Mohammed. Anything else from anybody on this one? Helen?
Well, I suppose I would just say that I suppose, I mean, as you pointed out, this is not necessarily a regulatory issue, but that doesn't mean that nobody's looking at it. And there will be some areas that you were talking about cybersecurity before, for example, that there are some areas where there is lots of other expertise in this, in more in say some security, or even in the intelligence services. There are other spaces where there may be expertise in that kind of could be useful to the regulatory task, where it is a regulatory task. So that is something to think about, particularly when it comes to common capacity, for example, to be kind of imaginative in where you look for expertise, because there may be pockets of it in other government agencies, for example, or in research organizations. And it is worth thinking about that, not sort of thinking about it in a narrow kind of way.
Brilliant. Thanks, Helen. We've got according to the big red clock, I've got 4 minutes 46 seconds left, so I'm gonna round up here, and in a second ask the panelists just for their thoughts on what's next, whether it's what's next in the next few weeks and months, or whether it's what's next in the AI and regulation over the next few years. I'll steal a bit of time using Chair's privilege to say that one thing that's very near to my heart, we've touched on a number of times here, is these points around regulators working together, both cross-sector and competency, and also internationally. And so for me, in terms of grappling what is this big amorphous beast called AI, try understanding how we work across regulators and more fluidly than we have done in the past, because the digital world is much more fluid than the old world. That's something which is going to be near and dear to my heart, and I think I see a lot more in that. I think initiatives such as the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum and the Regulation AI Working Group are indicative of the value that we can get from working together and sharing knowledge and coordinating our work where we can. So I'm now going to pass it around the group for a very quick comment from each. Does anyone want to start on this? Anybody feeling inspired? Mohammed and then Guy. Very close to Mohammed, then Guy, then Helen and Kate.
Thanks, Simon. I'll reiterate that point on coordination and collaboration among regulators nationally and internationally. And I think also like there are areas where sort of they're very, very interesting technical developments, which I think are going to change kind of and accelerate maybe the power of AI and the way it's done. And one of these is, you've kind of alluded to it already with Internet of Things. It's sort of these distributed systems and these network systems that can be, again, like a cross-border kind of systems. And I think this will change AI from a technical point of view. The other thing I think which is very interesting for us is, as I said before, data sort of are at the heart of AI systems. And I think there's a lot of work and understanding needs to be done around data economics, data flow through the economy, the value of data, and how to kind of measure those flows. We hear this often, that data is the new oil, or whatever that expression is. But we need a way of kind of putting value on that. And I think that work is going to be very, very valuable to our understanding of AI. So yeah, I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Thanks, Mohammed. Guy?
Yeah, I think one interesting thing to watch out for is going to be augmented reality and glasses, and that's got all sorts of potential applications in the advertising world that I work in. And just in terms of international collaboration, where I agree with you, it's going to be increasingly important. We had a lovely 10-minute call with the ASA in France just before Christmas, where we swapped our scam ad predictor code for their very good web scraping code. It was all done and dusted in short time, because we get on well with them and we trust each other and we want to collaborate, and it's had massive benefits already.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Guy. Helen?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about, I think there was a question about this somewhere, the question of a sort of multi-layered approach. Somebody asked, do we need regulation? Do we need guidance? Do we need, etc.? And I think any of the really tough problems that we've been talking about, they need all of those things. It's never an either or, really. And Kate mentioned the point about kind of companies regulating themselves. I think there is a role for regulation in sort of regulating what the companies are doing. When Twitter took Trump off their platform, for example, there was a lot of kind of discussion about that, an argument about that, was that wrong or was that right? And I think in general the consensus was that it was kind of right that he'd gone and right that he wasn't doing the kind of things he was doing, but it shouldn't have been an arbitrary decision from a social media platform. And it's a question of regulating how the companies are regulating themselves. What kind of content moderation policies do they have? What do they enforce them? Are they public? Are they known about? Are they discussed? Are they reviewed? Are they fit for purpose? So it is a question of building that into regulatory models, and I think that applies quite widely, not just to social media companies or the big giants. And yeah, we need to innovate in that area as well.
Absolutely, it's probably an entirely different full session on regulating big tech, which might not be as interesting to this audience, but is a pretty vital question, I think, for all of the regulatory community right now. Kate, over to you.
Okay, I'll be very quick because I think we're about to run out of time. I was just going to talk a bit about how, in the longer term, I think we'll start seeing effects of AI kind of being used across larger swathes and more of companies, kind of industry, and then you might be starting to see more of these kind of more global effects, I suppose, of them all using it. Something like collusion, which is between algorithms, of course. That sort of thing starts to happen when you start getting it used across a lot of the economy, which I think are quite interesting questions. And then I just had a general point really of what's next. I think there's a lot to do, because I think we're still at quite early stages about thinking about this area, like how do we regulate in this area? We're still in the foothills, so there's a lot about kind of how do we regulate such a kind of complex, I suppose, and varied technology, and still a lot more to come.
Absolutely, a lot to do. I think is a very good point to finish up on there. So all it leaves me to do is to thank everybody for I was going to say for dialing in, which shows my age, for dialing into this session, for viewing it through your chosen channel and media, and thank you again to the panel for their contributions. I think it's been a great session, and I hope everybody else enjoys the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.